Brussels-based NGO. And we are working on advocacy at the EU level to promote zero-waste society, and also to working towards European institutions, but also working with our members in various spheres in Europe towards also more local solutions. So we have zero-waste strategy to be implementing already on the ground. So the question is, what we are always gathering today is for why do we want to have this webinar? So again, what has been the thinking behind Zero Waste Europe since now almost 20 years? It's to really to work on the root cause of waste. So since the beginning, we have been starting to work on fighting against landfill incineration, and following the hierarchy, we're going higher and higher. And also that's why you're also expanding different areas of work. So being it plastic, bio-waste, and also more and more around textiles. So again, we're also working on more waste prevention as well, and reuse, and also how to have a recycling that is working. And this is really around the topic that we have today. So as we all know, the EU legislation has been introducing recycled content targets in different EU legislation. And the first one was on the single-use plastic directive. And also, for example, as part of the packaging waste regulation that has been released and is been currently under discussion. So a lot is happening on this file. And you also wanted to think that also as we are working on recycling and recycled content, also bring our perspective in this discussion. And so to recall also what are our priority, it's that for us at Zero Waste Europe, the base waste that is the one that doesn't exist. But of course, we know that there is a lot of waste already happening currently in the EU and also in the world. So the question is, how do we ensure that we have this waste being recycled? And what we are pushing for alongside waste prevention, reuse system, is to have an efficient recycling. So in this sphere, we see that introducing recycled content is a good way to force the shift to a more circular economy, and also to be sure that we have the good recycled content coming up from this recycling technology. So really the idea and what we've been pushing for in this discussion is really how to calculate and how to allocate recycled content coming from the new recycling technology that have been pushed towards, mostly chemical recycling. And so this is the object of this discussion today. So we will be releasing after our event, our last publication on this issue. So the publication has been prepared by the two of our panelists, so Gert Bergsma and Gert Varinga from CU Delft. And afterwards, we will have also a conversation and an opinion from our three other panelists. So Julia Wortgerding from the Commission, from DG Environment, and following by Carolina Gregorio from DAO, and finally by Mathilde Crépy from ECOS. I hope the pronunciation of your name was okay, and so I really look forward to the presentation that you will be doing. And so before we start, I would like to do a quick reminder on the tools of the webinar. So you can introduce yourself in the chat if you want to, but please, when it comes to the questions, submit it in the Q&A tool, and then afterwards I will be able to pass them to the speakers. And the Q&A box is located at the bottom bar of the webinar screen, and so please use it, and so then we can submit your question and ask them directly to the panelists. At the same time, we are also on live on YouTube, and so welcome as well on the person that are on YouTube, and every question that you will be submitting will be also liaised towards our speaker. So without further delay, I really say that we're gonna start today's conversation. And for our first speakers, that is from CU Delft, so it's Gert Varinga and Gert Bergsma. So they both are working at CU Delft and are working from the circular economy themes. The main point of their work is to consider, to help clients and to make more considered choice in the ever-present field of tension between the economy and the environment. And so their background in economics and environmental sciences help them identify the financial and the social cost of, and the benefits as well of the environmental policy. And so they would make their recommendation. So now, Gert and Gert, the floor is yours to present the main result of the study that Zero Waste Europe has been commissioned with, together with RPA, the Rethink Plastic Alliance. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Lauriane, for your introduction. I hope everyone can see the screen right now. Okay, perfect. Well, as Lauriane introduced, we were asked to determine the environmental impacts of allocation rules on chemical recycling. And why is this? Yeah, okay. And well, you already introduced our company. Indeed, we are located in Delft. Here you can see the picture of our beautiful office. But first, some background on chemical recycling and why are allocation rules required? Well, we have shown that in two illustrations. Right here, you see at the right side on the top, you see long loop chemical recycling. And that's a process in which plastic waste is converted into multiple outputs. You see via some intermediate steps, you see new plastic products, but also other products, other chemicals and fuels. So there are multiple outputs, and therefore it's required to allocate the plastic waste, the recycled content, to the different outputs. For other chemical recycling processes, so-called short loop chemical recycling and mechanical recycling, there are no multiple outputs, but just one single output by various intermediate steps. So there are no allocation rules required. So that's very important to understand that for long loop chemical recycling, allocation rules are required, and for the mechanical and short loop chemical recycling processes, there are no allocation rules required. Well, now at the moment there are three allocation rules under discussion in Europe. You have proportional allocation, polymers only, and fuels exempt. And they differ in allocation. If you speak about proportional allocation, then the input, so the plastic waste, that is proportionally allocated along the three outputs. So for instance, if in the chemical process 5% of plastic waste is used as an input, then all the outputs have 5% of recycled content. For polymers only, there's more allocation freedom than for the other products and the fuels. It is still, there's allocation requirements, but within the category of plastic products, the chemical companies, they can freely allocate the content to the products with the highest value. So there's more allocation freedom. And in fuels exempt, it only has to be allocated to fuels. So then chemical companies, they can allocate freely between new plastic products and also other products to allocate to the products with the highest values. So yeah, the more allocation freedom there is, the higher the financial benefits of a long loop chemical recycling. So yeah, that can bring attention on the level playing field, because there are more incomes for long loop chemical recycling, while mechanical and short loop recycling, they cannot allocate to the highest outputs. So there's a risk that long loop chemical recycling buys up the plastic waste in that competitive area. So the objective of the study is to determine the impact of the allocation rules on the environment and the level playing field between the various recycling technologies. Well, and if we go a bit deeper on the impacts of the level playing field, well, here you see a picture of hypothetical example, but realistic. And I won't dive too deep into all the details, but what you can see is on the left, you see plastic waste that can go to mechanical recycling or short loop chemical recycling. And you see in the picture, you see various financial consequences of the allocation methods. Well, and what you can see is that for 5 ton of input of plastic waste, the extra incomes can add up to 4,000 euros. So that's quite substantial. And now I will give the word to my colleague Geert Bergsma, who will tell you more about the environmental consequences of.
Okay, thank you, Geert. I'm from the environmental department on the LCA department, and we helped also other Geert with this study. First, we started with a study we did for the Dutch government, monitoring of chemical recycling for the Dutch government, with cases with industry in which we looked at the plastic-to-plastic yields for mechanical recycling monostreams, also mechanical recycling mixed streams, much lower, 60%, short loop recycling 99%, and pyrolysis 49%. We did that. We calculated that 49% together with several companies. And we discussed that with NGOs and government, and the Dutch government will use this also for their policies. So we started with this plastic-to-plastic yield for the different technologies, and we combined that with the mix of waste. Next slide. Because the discussion was, can we say something about what will happen with more long loop chemical recycling or more mechanical recycling? And we discussed that, and we found out that the Netherlands is interesting for this because there are 2 scenarios in the discussion. That the transition agenda that's developed in 2018 in discussion between government and industry, and in that agenda there was a target of 40% recycling, and 75% of that would be mechanical recycling. Also some long loop and some short loop chemical recycling. Was discussion about how much, but we said here we expect that it will be more long loop than short loop. Maybe there's a discussion with that, but at 75%, 25% was that in that transition agenda, and we think we can use that. 2 years later, in the Netherlands, there was another scenario called roadmap chemical recycling, with a lot of attention for pyrolysis, some gasification, and in that agenda, no mechanical recycling, but almost all long loop recycling, and short loop recycling, only 20%. So we think for the Dutch situation, it's interesting to look at both this agenda, both in the discussion, and to look at the differences. We transformed that to Europe because Netherlands is interesting, but Europe is bigger. So you have 55 megaton of plastics. There's less waste because of the stock. We use plastic for cars and buildings and other things, so waste is less. And we also looked at the maximum sorting and separating yields. Here you see 70% for packaging. For packaging, it's lower. It's 40 or 50% for electronics. Maximum 70%. It's much lower. Agriculture, but we looked at the maximum. So we wanted a scenario with maximum results, and available recycling materials would be 24%, 24 megaton in Europe. That's not the case now, but it could be if we use everything. Then we calculated the transition scenario and the roadmap scenario. Transition is more mechanical, not all, but more mechanical, 75%. And the roadmap is more long loop chemical recycling. So we tried to calculate that. So we looked at the differences. Next one. We started with 2018. We used figures from Plastic Europe for that. Plastic Europe, also the Netherlands. We also looked at if you transform that to 2040, there will be a lot of efficiency in producing of plastics. They promise 2% per year. It's a discussion if they really will reach that, but that's in this scenario. Less landfill, so more incineration. So there's 110 megatons of CO2 if you don't change anything. But we want to recycle more, and there's the discussion, will that be almost all mechanical recycling, or will that be a lot of long loop chemical recycling? And there we had two scenarios, the roadmap chemical recycling with a lot of long loop chemical recycling, and the transition agenda with more mechanical recycling. But it's good to emphasize that we have a very conservative scenario for mechanical recycling, because it's also mixed waste mechanical recycling with only a plastic yield of 60%. We have some also lower yields that are now occurring, but it could be increased. Even with its conservative approach for mechanical recycling, you see that the mechanical recycling performs much better on CO2. You have a much larger CO2 gain. And we also calculated the maximum circularity index. That's the next slide. And the transition agenda, there you see that 32% of recycled content is possible. Even with more monostreams, maybe you can go to 40, but the idea was very conservative for mechanical recycling, and with long loop chemical recycling, you have 26. So there's a real difference which you can reach. Some people say, why isn't this 60 or 70%? And that's because of the amount of waste is much lower than the amount of plastic we use. And that's because of the long life products like cars and houses. But this is the difference you can reach with more or less long loop chemical recycling. Next one. So to my colleague again.
Yeah, so the conclusions, proportional allocation reduces the risks of scenarios with a large share of long loop chemical recycling. Well, in such a scenario, the maximum CO2 benefits are 9 megatons lower in 2040 than in a scenario with more mechanical recycling, and that are the potential maximum CO2 benefits. So that's good to stress that. While the maximum achievable recycling rate is 32% instead of 26%. So considering that, if a larger allocation freedom is chosen, one could consider to put a cap on chemical recycling to decrease the risks of long loop chemical recycling outcompeting mechanical recycling. Well, if you ask what kind of value could be placed on such a cap, we could think of 12.5 to 25% of maximum long loop recycling based on that Dutch transition agenda. And further recommendations are to consider to implement more norms and products groups that can meet the targets with mechanical recycling. So other product groups than packaging with food contact waste. And yeah, what also is good to consider is that, for instance, in the Netherlands, there will be a policy on all polymers, a norm on all polymers, so not just some product groups, of 25 to 30% in 2030. So it's very good to consider that, and perhaps other countries could follow that example. So, well, that was our presentation. I'm curious if there are questions.
Thank you, Gert and Gert, for your both presentation. You can remove the slides if you want, it would be possible. And so, therefore, without any attempt, I will be happy to introduce our second speaker, who is
yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, so as I was saying, thank you for the presentation, and all the questions will be taken afterwards during the Q&A session. So every panelist will be able to answer the question that have been directly linked to them. And if some of the question you think that you might have replied to them beforehand, please feel free to do so. And so now our further second part of the panelists, and also to have a more institutional point of view on this discussion, I'm really pleased to invite Julia Rotter-Ging from the European Commission from DG Environment I hope the pronunciation of your name is great. And so I will be, Julia is a policy officer of the European Commission of the Digital Environment, and she's working on the Single-Use Plastic Directive as part of the Circular Economy Unit. And before joining the Commission in 2018, she worked as a scientific manager for several universities. And Julia is graduated in mathematics and holds a PhD in engineering and physical mathematical modeling. And she studied and worked in Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK. And so now, Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk about chemical recycling and mass balance accounting from the Commission's perspective. I will share my presentation. Can you see it?
It's changing. And
yes, can you see it?
I think it's charged. Your screen is charging. Yeah, no, it's perfect. We can see it.
Okay, perfect. Yes, so I will not spend much time on introducing you to the context of the European Green Deal, the plastic strategy, the circular economy action plan, and so on and so forth, and directly jump into presenting some figures, some of which you have already seen. So in Europe, there are about 55 megatons of plastic consumed every year, of which around 30 megatons of plastic waste are collected and sorted. Around 10 megatons are sent for recycling, and only 5.5 megatons were recycled into new plastics. So I showed you this to make clear that what is important is that we scale up the collection, sorting, and recycling in order to meet our recycling and recycled content targets. Also, when looking at the waste hierarchy, it becomes clear that recycling is but one element to make the plastics more circular, that the focus is on prevention and preparing for reuse, refill, and that recycling is then the third option. And also in this context, design for recycling requirements are a very important element to reach the circularity of plastics. When speaking about recycled plastics, we have foreseen to introduce recycled content targets in order to boost the demand for recyclates. And we foresee such targets in packaging, construction materials, vehicles, to name a few. And as Florian already said, the Single-Use Plastics Directive has been the first piece of European legislation to set binding targets for recycled content. In this case, we have the target for 2025 that 25% of PET bottles has to be recycled material, and 30% recycled content for all SUP beverage bottles by 2030. Now coming to chemical recycling, and here I'm talking mainly about what Gert Waringa called long loop recycling, or what we also call thermal depolymerization, so for example pyrolysis or gasification. We see that these type of technologies have a number of potential advantages, but also disadvantages. So the main advantages we see are that recycled material is of virgin-like quality, which is particularly important for specific applications such as food contact material or medical applications, for example, and that this virgin-like quality can be achieved only through chemical recycling and not mechanical recycling. The second point is that chemical recycling has a potential to process some mixed and contaminated and otherwise difficult to mechanically recycle plastic waste streams, and that it has lower impacts environmentally than the alternative of incineration. Okay, so the disadvantages we see are that, as has been mentioned by the previous speakers, chemical recycling technologies have a lower yield, a significantly lower yield than mechanical recycling. They are more energy intensive and lead to emissions such as greenhouse gas emissions. And we also see the risk, the potential risk of that chemical recycling using input waste that could also be recycled mechanically. Yes, as a general rule, our point is that we see mechanical recycling being preferable to chemical recycling, and that chemical recycling is still preferable to the alternative of incineration. And this is also backed by a recent study from the Joint Research Center on Environmental and Economic Assessment of Plastic Waste Recycling. So to conclude on this slide, we see that chemical recycling should complement mechanical recycling if it causes less environmental burden than incineration and virgin plastic production. Now coming to the calculation method. So this slide is showing what you have already seen though. So the main difference between controlled blending and mass balance chain of custody models. And the importance that mass balance cannot do only with controlled blending. So, sorry, I'm mixing it up. So thermal depolymerization, such as pyrolysis and gasification, do need mass balance accounting in order to calculate recycled content, whereas mechanical recycling and certain short loop chemical recycling technologies could do without mass balance and only use controlled blending. And here we see again the three possible allocation methods that are discussed: the proportional, the polymers only, and the fuel use excluded. I will not go through them because Gert Waringa has already presented these. And now when we look at the calculation of recycled content in the context of the SUP directive, as I said earlier, the SUP directive has been the first piece of European legislation to introduce the binding targets. So it is also the first piece for which we need to establish a methodology to calculate, verify, and also report on recycled content. Because it's important to keep in mind that the targets of the SUP directive are set on member states level and not, for example, on product level or on producer level. So we approach this task to develop the methodology for the SUP directive in two steps. First, we focused on a simple methodology that covers only mechanically recycled PET. And the second step will be to amend this methodology to introduce controlled blending and mass balance. And the reason for this is, for these two steps, is mainly a practical one, that we have been that there we are under considerable time pressure to introduce this methodology, and also the observation that about 97% of the SUP beverage bottles are made of PET, which can be perfectly mechanically recycled. So we decided to cover this big bulk of bottles first, and then attend in the second step to the remaining few percent that need a more complex system to calculate the recycled content. Yes, we are discussing proportional polymers only and fuel use excluded allocation as possible allocation rules. And for the second step, it will be important to establish a system for verification that is based on third-party certification, because it is more complex than the simple methodology of the first step. The first step is on the way. It is currently open for public feedback until the end of May, and we hope to adopt it in mid of June. For the second step, our indicative timeline is that after the ongoing internal assessment on the different possibilities to define a mass balance method, We will draft the proposal and discuss it first with the member states. We hope to have a draft ready to be opened for public feedback in autumn and to adopt the amended methodology at the end of this year. So with this, I wish to come to my final slide summarizing the key messages. So it is very important to point out that both mechanical and chemical recycling need to be upscaled and need to advance in order to reach our circular economy goals. It is not sufficient to rely only on mechanical recycling. It is clear that, however, chemical recycling should complement mechanical recycling and not replace it. And we see the need for a cooperation along the whole value chain of plastics, starting at the design stage with design for recycling criteria, going on for the use stage, using products as long as possible, repairing them, reusing, and then it comes to recycling. And when talking about recycling, my main message here really is that more important than how to split up the cake of recycling is that we all seek to make this cake bigger in total. So this should be our focus. With this, I thank you for your attention. And yes, I'm happy to take questions in the panel discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, Julia, for your presentation and bringing the more institutional point of view in the discussion. I saw one of the questions in the Q&A session, and I wanted to recall a bit the definition of recycling and what we understand in Europe as recycling is that all production of fuel are being, by the law and by the definition of recycling defined in the Waste Framework Directive, out of the conversation, because any production of fuel does not count as any recycling activity. So from this perspective, I would like to really put this part of the discussion out of today's webinar, because in the case of the EU, this type of production are not part of the any recycling activity. So just to...
Yes, exactly. That's why the so-called free allocation has not been included in the discussion at all, because that is off the table.
Yeah. Thank you for also complimenting Julia, just also to be clear that everyone is on the same page. So thank you for your presentation, Julia. And now we're going to move to our third speaker of the day, who is Carolina Gregorio from DAO. So Carolina is Policy and Advocacy Director, EMEA DAO Packaging and Plastic Specialty in Plastics. So Carolina joined DAO in 2007, and since then she held several roles in the packaging and focusing mostly on plastic, and which includes a global project for some DAO packagings and developing an innovation platform. So in March of last year, she assumed her current role as Policy and Advocacy Director, and she's in charge to follow the sustainability, circular and net zero plastic policies in discussion in Europe, and to enable those and the industry to transition toward a new circular and net zero sustainable plastic models. So Carolina holds a degree in chemical engineering from Santiago de Compostela University in Spain, and she's now engaged in LEAP 2023 program to focus on women and sustainability in partnership with the Yale University and ESADE Business School to design and open horizon to raise awareness among businesses to rethink our current system and how we can operate within it. So after this presentation, Carolina, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Lorian. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks especially Lorian and Zero Waste Europe team for inviting us to play a role in this webinar. I'm very honored to represent DAO's view on this matter, and I will try my best to represent as well industry views on this matter. So let me jump into the topic. I very happy to hear from Julia, previous speaker as well, that the key message for all in, is like starting from the fact that circularity will play a key role in enabling our plastics industry net zero journey, meeting European Green Deal objectives and industry ambition to become net zero by 2050. We want to refer to different systemic IQ reports that were launched last year. On the left, you have the Planet Positive Chemicals. This is a global chemicals report that is forecasting scenarios by 2050 of net zero that are indicating that at least, we need a drastic reduction in fossil raw materials for the chemicals industry, up to 75% less by 2050 to achieve net zero, substituting fossil raw materials by circular renewable raw materials derived from waste, derived from bio, and derived from carbon capture technologies. On the right, you have the one that was released last year that is focusing on plastics in Europe, and the conclusions are very much on the same line. So circularity is a key enabler of net zero. And if we walk through more details on how we can get there, this is a plastics industry European ecosystem net zero 2050 scenario drafted in the Reshaping Plastics report by Systemic IQ. And it's saying that different levers are needed to get us there. The first two ones, I'm fully endorsing the waste hierarchy that Julia was presenting, is yes, reduction and substitution, they will play a role. Reducing what is not needed to use is the first pillar. Reusing what is possible and brings environmental benefits versus single use in approving LCA should be done. And afterwards, recycle is the third largest lever. So the scenarios forecasting and utilization of fossil by 2050 of only 25% versus today. So 75% will need to come from alternative renewable circular carbon sources. Out of that, 50% from wastes sources. On that 50%, 60% from mechanical recycling, 40% from chemical recycling in a complementing manner. You see the figures on the slide. On top of that, bio will need to play a role as well. We're around 20% of utilization of feedstocks for the industry, and carbon capture will be around 5% remaining one. I will not stop myself in those different LCA reports that are being launched and available publicly, because Julia also made the reference. The first one has been released very recently, the GRC report on environmental and economic assessment of plastic waste, comparing different alternatives of plastic and of waste routes, reconfirming that recycling is best in all dimensions, from climate change and other environmental perspective versus energy recovery. Mechanical recycling is the best option, as Julia said. Chemical recycling is the next best, and it can be able to provide up to 40% of carbon savings in a cradle-to-grave scenario versus plastics incineration. So it's the way to go to get us there. So circularity and climate protection, they need to go hand in hand, and that's well we see what is going on in Euro policy targets, and Julia said I will not describe all the things that are in discussion, but it's important to realize that recycled content plastic targets that we are supporting are an effective policy instrument with others to stimulate the creation of a new circular plastic economy, not only for packaging, but for all the plastics markets, like, for example, automotive, construction, and many others. And not only for plastics, but as well for chemicals, as we just said in the introduction. So this is the way to go to get to a net zero future. But we see the policy, but we see as well the market, right? Because we have a business. So we are an industry, that's what it does as well, because we see market pull for it. So beyond the minimum legal targets, we see a strong appetite by markets, especially in plastics, in packaging, and you see on the left, and in plastics in automotive, because we have brands that they have been pledged externally voluntary public commitments to advance recycling plastic utilization. Packaging averaged 25% by 2025, being pledged by large brand owners playing mostly in food and beverage packaging segment, and automotive OEM that are pledging around 20% use as well by 2030 on average, and those are public informations. So if we have a look to the polyolefins market in Europe, we see, just to bring as well a perspective of where we are right now, we see that 4 million metric tons per year of polyolefins are today landfill in Europe yearly. This is 2020 data, and 7 million metric tons of polyolefins are being incinerated. So those carbon sources are today being lost for circularity. And this is something that we don't want. We have a tremendous opportunity as an industry with enable effective policies to be able to make sure that those carbon are back into the system in a circular economy model, and we minimize the utilization of virgin fossil feedstocks. Industry has announced both investments in mechanical recycling. Plastic Recycling Europe has released recently annual report recording a 13% capacity increase growth, which is great. The industry has as well released a combined investment announcement of 7.3 billion euros by 2030 to scale up circular plastics through chemical recycling up to levels of 3 million metric tons of polyolefins by 2030. And why is that? I want to insist is the point that Julia mentioned, complementarity. Chemical recycling and mechanical recycling are complementing technologies because they can handle different waste inputs and they can produce different, I would say, outputs. Also, chemical recycling is not only capable, because Julia mentioned, to handle contaminated plastic wastes that mechanical recycling cannot, but also can produce food contact and high performance recycled plastics for regulated applications like food packaging and automotive. So for us, it's complementing, and we see both, as systemic EQ is saying, will need to play a role together with other levers like reduction and reuse. So on that, we are fully aligned as well with the European Commission views on that matter. So DAOs, a little bit about us. So for me, the key point here is we have pledged externally to become net zero in all scopes 1, 2, and 3 by 2050. And we have released end of last year our Transform the Waste global goal, which sets that by 2030, we will commercialize 3 million metric tons of circular and renewable solutions annually, coming from plastic wastes and other forms of alternative feedstocks. This is all about getting use more of renewable carbon as substituting fossil carbon sources, as I said, to make sure that carbon keeps in the loop for longer, moving us into a new circular model. And for doing that, we have different pillars because, of course, we need a waste collection and sorting, but we need to design for recyclability. This is the beginning of the journey. Recyclability is an essential legal requirement. We are fully endorsing that provision because this is crucial to make sure that at the end of the cycle, the loop can be closed. So industry has been and now investing in innovations to enable that polymers to come with those characteristics to enable recyclability at the end of the cycle. We now, and industry is investing both in mechanical and advanced recycling with different partners. We are investing as well to scale up bio-based plastics produced from biomass as sustainable source. And we are working in scaling up technologies to reduce our carbon footprint, scope 1 and 2 of our operational processes to produce plastics and chemicals. And why we need mass balance, I think is clear. We need mass balance. I hear from my previous as well speakers, right? But let me also make the point here, and this is a true picture, and this flow chart is coming from Petrochemics Europe, and this was launched as well this year. The current production processes of chemicals and plastics are large-scale processes, complex in their nature because they are using multiple inputs, different sources of fossil inputs, and we will need to use, as well as I said, multiple different sources of renewable carbon sources moving forward as we are committed and doing. And also those processes are producing multiple outputs. So that's the reason why large scale, multiple inputs, multiple outputs, and the impossibility to physically segregate those streams, that's the reason we need mass balance. And in the different allocation models that the previous speakers as well were kind of, I would say, mentioning our view on this matter, and we understand and we fully endorse as DAO and industry, because the industry has released a public statement signed by 31 organizations of the plastics value chain in Europe very recently, endorsing and supporting the fuel use exemption allocation model as the most effective way to go, understanding, of course, that fuels cannot be counted for recycling and recycled content. But if we just compare the fuel use exempt, polymers only, and proportional on discussion on today, fuel use exempt will be the most optimal to enable with the minimum cost. And this is important because Gerd mentioned, that's affordability downstream and generating most possibilities for circularity at scaling up faster and also to be the most optimal in terms of the optimize the capacity to be built to meet certain recycled content targets. This way we can ensure that if we build optimal capacity, because nobody wants to build over capacity, right? If it's not needed to meet recycled targets and market demand, we will be able to make this in the most cost-effective and environmental effective manner. So that's why a few years ago, we're able to reach those bold recycled content targets that policy is claiming for and market is asking us for in the most cost and environmental effective manner. To be able as well in a third-party accredited system that we are fully endorsing to make transparent and credible claims in front of consumers by brands. And this is our views. I think I covered all what I wanted to say. This is just a summary, but I will not make more time use. I think I covered my main message, and I'm very much open to any questions that you have afterwards in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carolina, for your presentation. And now we will be having our last speaker, last but not least, as the expression is saying. So we have our last speaker, who is Mathilde Crépy from ECOS. So Mathilde is the head of environment transparency at ECOS, the Environmental Coalition on Standards. So there she leads a team of staff working on green claims, voluntary sustainability standards, corporate sustainable finance, and on green claims. She's responsible of the organization's work on chain of custody standards, including the application of recycled content claims. And after obtaining a master's degree in environmental law and political sciences, she joined the commission, worked there until 2017, and after she joined ECOS. So now, Mathilde, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Great. Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, mass balance. So I'm Mathilde Crépy, Head of Environmental Transparency at ECOS. I'll introduce my presentation with a few words about ECOS for those of you who don't know who we are. So we are a member-based environmental NGO with 57 national, European, and international members scattered all over, well, Europe and beyond. And basically, we work on standards and technical policies that apply to products and industrial processes mostly, in a context where we are trying to transition to a low carbon and circular economy. We have been following and working on plastic value chains for quite some time, and the issue of recycled content also for several years, which has led us to participating in several discussions with relations to chain of custody models and allocation methodologies on recycled content. So I have a few preliminary remarks that I want to make to start on the topic of recycled content for plastic value chains. First of all, we often hear about mass balance singular, or the mass balance approach singular. So mass balance is an umbrella term covering a wide variety of situations, which actually have been very well theorized and summarized in the ICL paper that I put here on the slide. So basically, whenever you choose to mix, any inputs that are of different nature, so be it recycled content with virgin content, you have several choices that you can make. So you can choose to mix at various levels, be it at production line, or at batch level, at site level, or at multi-site levels. And you have various attribution rules for allocating the certified inputs. So my plea to start this presentation is not to say that there is a mass balance approach, but always specify under what conditions we're talking about mass balance. This is extremely important. So in several papers, actually, we've seen a promotion for the mass balance approach, the so-called mass balance approach, promoting the most flexible kind of mass balance approach, including, full free allocation and including the recognition of multi-site credit transfer is the most flexible way that you can, mix inputs with different characteristics. So here I took the other opposite end for once, and I'm showing a picture of let's say the most stringent way to talk about mass balance, which is the batch level mass balance approach, whereby products are mixed within a production line, and the attribution rule for claiming the certified input is a full proportional attribution. So meaning that all products bear the same claim. It's not, one product that is that bear claims saying I'm 100% made from recycled content. No, all three products are 33% made from recycled content. So this is actually the kind of mass balance approach that we civil society organization call for when it comes to allocating or accounting for recycled content. And the reasons are various. So in the report that you will all read very carefully once it's in the public domain, you have these figures that very well visualize the potential problem with the different allocation methodologies. So here we have three pictures. The input is exactly the same. The input is always you put 10% recycled content in, 90% virgin material in, and then depending on the allocation key or the allocation methodology, you can make a different claim. So we're focusing on this polymer one. Let's imagine that polymer one would be food contact material, because it's possible. So in the first case, you would be claiming 10% recycled content, while in the third case, the fuels exempt case, you would be claiming 50% recycled content on your product, while not having made any single change to the production process. We think this is very problematic for several reasons. So first of all, what we see with these examples is that the more diverse the outputs, so the more complex, let's say, the process, and the more the more you get outputs out of the process. So which is typically the case in case of long, let's say, of long recycling processes involving gasification or pyrolysis. And the more flexible the methodology, the easier it is to meet legal requirements on recycled content. So, coming back to the example where polymer one would be food contact material. In case you have a fuels exempt model, you would be able to only with 2 units of recycled content in the process, fed into the process, and 98% of virgin material, you would be able to claim 10% recycled content and meet the legal requirements. So this is really hiding completely the dilution factor that has actually been involved in the process, given that you haven't fed 10% into the process, but 2% of recycled inputs into the process. The second reason why we think we should go for a proportional allocation, it is because if we recognize that only long recycling processes are the ones that could get could be claiming recycled content based on mass balance and potentially unproportional allocation, it means that the other it is unfair competition with the more simpler chemical recycling processes or mechanical recycling, since these processes will have to to go for a proportional allocation in the sense that they do not produce multi outputs, so several outputs. So the more the outputs and the more flexible the methodology, again, the more unfair the competition with other recycling technologies. While we have seen that those recycling technologies may be less energy intensive, and also those recycling technologies do not necessarily require by design to be fed such a high amount of virgin material in the first place. So I want also to highlight the fact that in this case, we're talking about lock-in technologies. So technologies which, if we, technologies which continue to rely extremely heavily on fossil fuel, and depending on the allocation methodology that is used to claim recycled content, the fact that it heavily relies on fossil fuel will completely be hidden on the claim made on the product at the end of the day. Which brings me to my third point, which is that we often hear that free allocation is the way to go if we want to drive the circular economy. I would argue exactly the opposite. To our understanding and to all civil society organizations' understanding, the more diverse the outputs and the more flexible the methodology with relations to accounting and claiming the recycled content, the less likely the benefits for the circular economy, the less it will drive the demand for more recycled content. We actually just heard in the presentation before, I'm sorry, Carolina, that one of the main objectives and the main advantages of the fuels exempt model is that it helps not building overcapacity in recycling facilities and making cost-effective decisions. This is really, cost effectiveness is the only reason why a fuels exempt model would be promoted, not the fact that it helps building the circular economy. So if you're allowed and able to claim on the market a 50% recycled content on products while only feeding 10% into the inputs, you can very easily make sure that the market you basically leverage the demand for recycled content according to what the market needs and what legal obligations are, without going beyond that. So in an ideal world, chain of custody and recycled content accounting should be all about building trust, reflecting the reality as close as possible, and achieving sustainability. If mixing is needed, then we need to make sure that the outputs for recycled content is evenly attributed across all production for the reasons I just explained. And if there is no knowledge about the product, there should not be any claim. This is something that we actually see in other sectors. For example, in the textile sector, companies, brands are making less and less claim at product level when they rely on mass balance. They're starting to make claims more at company level, not at product level. So this is something that I haven't discussed, but I want to bring to the attention of people that, in the plastic and in the chemicals value chains, there may be practices that are different and that could learn from other sectors in terms of how communication is done to consumers and in terms of transparency towards consumers. Another thing that I haven't talked about yet is the fact that it's okay not to be able to claim 100% recycled content or a high percentage of recycled content. Actually, ChemSec has done a very good study showing that brands want more, transparency and credibility. So they're more afraid of managing their reputational risks rather than claiming something that is extremely high in terms of recycled contents. So there is no reason why we should, make sure that the rules are done in such a way that it is easy to claim high recycled content, because the market does not necessarily want to claim high recycled content. And last but not least, we should be very careful when granting flexibility. So typically, if granting, the possibility to freely allocate recycled content to the different outputs, because once this flexibility is given, it is very, very difficult to take it back and to move towards, a polymers only or a proportional allocation type of rule. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathilde, and thank you to all the speakers. So now we'll start our Q&A session, and just also to remind to the audience that if you want to have your question being considered and being transferred to the panelists, please put it in the Q&A box that is on your screen, so then we'll be able to address it. And I would like to start this Q&A session with quite simple but also general question is, according to you, what is a recycled content? What do you consider being as recycled content? So it is quite broad, an open question, and who wants to take the floor the first is the one can do it. So Carolina, Mathilde, Julia, Gert or Gert, you can take the floor.
Okay, then maybe I just start. So recycled content so speaking of recycled plastic content, we understand that it has to come from plastic waste, and that it has undergone recycling operation, which excludes fuels. So fuels cannot have recycled content. And that it is a plastic as per the definition of plastic and the Single-Use Plastics Directive in the final product. I cannot hear you, Florian?
Yeah. So okay. Anyone would like to jump in, or we've got quite a lot of questions already from the audience, so we can also move on to some other question if you want to. And the first question would be for Gert and Gert. So first question is regarding how you have been defining chemical recycling within the study. How do you make the differences between long loop and short loop chemical recycling? If you can elaborate a bit on this.
Long loop is pyrolysis and gasification and something like that. And short loop for PET is depolymerization, maybe also for PS. You see dissolution. About dissolution you can debate, is that physical, is that chemical? And I think also dissolution for PE, PP, we also consider that as chemical, but we say that can also be considered as physical. But long loop, most pyrolysis, but also gasification.
Thank you, Gert. And we've been also having quite a lot of questions regarding the type of feedstock that could enter, could be considered in this discussion. So from a comment, we've seen that most of the presentation from Gert and Julia were focusing much more on PET, when the presentation from Carolina was much more focusing on polyolefin. So which type of feedstock are you actually considering when you are presenting your...
We were considering a mix. So we looked at the mix in Europe and the Netherlands, and then short loop chemical recycling, that's more for PET. Long loop is more for PE and PP, and you can discuss for other materials. So this the current mix, you can also debate, are we shifting to PLA or PEF or some other thing, but we said the current mix, we make that a little bit bigger. And we look at the current kind of recycling, because we also had a debate on mechanical recycling. Also, mechanical recycling can be improved, but now we also have the mechanical recycling going to the building materials, mixed recycling. We have included that also in it, so there is also improvement possible for mechanical recycling. But we used the mix, so PET is not going to pyrolysis, PET is going to depolymerization, and maybe, but Carolina can tell me, there could be a shift between materials where we have it's the same material as the material mix now.
Yeah, sorry. Carolina, if you want to complement answer from Gert.
No, I think Gert was explaining this well. I mean, I focus my speech on polyolefins because this is the market we play. But of course, there are different polymers types and there are different recycling technologies, as Gert explained, right? I mean, we normally I would say, like, normally in industry, when they use that terminology, so closed loop, I would say like short loop and long loop. This is not normally used, but I mean, it's perfectly applicable in a sense, like I read a report. The important part here is all the plastic wastes should be counted, and all the recycling different routes should be taken into account, right? Because what we want to do is to stimulate a plastic circular economy developing at a scale. And for that, we need to make sure that recycling plastics is increasing as much as possible. We use, I would say, waste-derived feedstocks for producing new plastics and chemicals as much as possible to diminish our reliance of fossil feedstocks. And for that, we want to stimulate the market demand with recycled content targets, meeting as well those needs from different markets to use those recycled contents as much as possible, right? So that would be kind of my complement.
Thank you. Another question is that we hear a lot that chemical recycling creates virgin quality plastic, and it can handle mixed and contaminated waste. And so there is this part of the narrative that has been done, but there is also another part of the narrative saying that chemical recycling has also certain requirements to meet. And from this perspective, there is this question, what's the, I mean, where do we first could find the answer, if there is any links to share? And also that there is question regarding the economic viability of certain of chemical recycling. As it has been mentioned, there is a quite reliance on also virgin material. So what is also the economic aspect of this process?
We did several projects with companies, with pyrolysis companies, and all have different input limits. Most say we don't like PET, but some have some sorting of PET or other things. PVC is also a problem. But in general, pyrolysis can have more materials as an input than mechanical recycling, but it's changing, and some pyrolysis plants are more strict than others. But the discussion is where do you set what's the balance, and where you steer it to pyrolysis or to mechanical recycling, and is there a balance in policies? And we found out in several studies that there is a limit on the amount of plastic you have available. So you like to have as much as possible to short loop and mechanical recycling. And there you see that with this scenario analysis, scenarios which are really in the Dutch discussion, you see one scenario really focusing on long loop chemical recycling, the other really focusing on mechanical recycling. You see the difference, but it's really on that debate. And I think everybody said you need a little bit of long loop chemical recycling, but the debate is about how much do you need.
Yes, maybe I can directly add to Gert's comment. So first I wanted to point out in report that might be interesting, which had been done by Eunomia together with the Alliance to End Plastic Waste last year, which is about the feedstock quality requirements for pyrolysis, and which shows that indeed, as Gert says, pyrolysis can deal with some mixed polyolefinic waste like PP, PE mixtures, but that there are certain limits, and the report also discusses which limits are for which types of substances and polymers, and it finds that the maximum total contamination is about 15% that is admitted. So maybe just that might be of interest for the audience. And actually, I would like to put a comprehension question on the study, Gert, regarding the second scenario, the roadmap, because there you showed on the slide that this would imply 0% of mechanical recycling and 100% of chemical recycling happening. And yes, I was quite surprised by this approach, and I tried to check that actually, but my Dutch is unfortunately very well, not very well at all. So I wondered if you could explain a bit better how it comes to this 0% of mechanical recycling when looking at the second scenario.
It's good to say that they start with chemical recycling, and we want to have 10% of the production in the Netherlands. That's 5.5 megatons produced by chemical recycling. And then you need 1,000 till 1,500 kilotons of materials. And the amount of waste in the Netherlands is 1,100. So you need more than the amount of waste in the Netherlands. And the discussion is there import possible? And some people say import is possible, but most would be import from UK, Belgium, the neighboring countries. But all neighboring countries have also recycling targets. And if you try to discuss, is it really possible to import that? Then the real consequence, it's not in that scenario, but the real consequence would be if you want so much chemical recycling that there will be very small room for mechanical recycling. Maybe not zero, but and also if you look at the subsidy claim in that plan with millions of euros for subsidies for that pyrolysis plant, it will be very difficult for mechanical recycling. But it's not in the plan that we stop with mechanical recycling, but the amount you need is so much that mechanical recycling will be rather low. Maybe not zero, but maybe 20%. So it's something about 25% for chemical or 25% for mechanical recycling. Clear?
Yes, I understand that it's an assumption that you make that basically everything just goes to chemical recycling and there is nothing left for mechanical recycling. Whereas when I just look at the bars, because that's what I could read, it seems that the roadmap assumes that mechanical recycling will increase as well in the amounts that are mechanically recycled. So
yeah, and the real debate
yes,
is about
the proportions will change, but it does not look at all as if mechanical recycling would necessarily stop. But
yeah, the real debate is import possible from neighboring countries, or are the neighboring countries steered by you also recycling everything, and is that not possible? And also the policies combined with that scenario are really focused on chemical recycling, but I agree with you, they don't say we want to stop mechanical recycling.
Thank you. And another question we got from the audience is like, will the recycling content targets plastic design for reuse and reduction? And what is or will the regulations such as the Single-Use Plastic Directive take this risk into account? I think this one is much more for you, Julia.
Yes. So the Single-Use Plastics Directive does not include specific targets for for reuse or refill, but it has consumption reduction targets, but not for beverage bottles, which has recycled content targets, but for cups for beverages and food containers. There it has a section on looking forward to implement consumption reduction targets in the future, and therefore member states already have to take measures to reduce their consumption. But I want to point out that the SUP directive, the approach of the SUP directive is that it looks at the litter that is found at the European beaches and looks for each type of category, what is the best measure to tackle that. So it has different measures for different types of plastic litter that has been found. So for the beverage bottles, we have the recycled content targets. For others, we have other measures, and those products that could be easily replaced by alternatives to single-use plastic, they have been banned, like single-use plates and stirrers, and so on and so on. But I wish also to point out to the upcoming packaging waste regulation, which is more concrete on measures on reducing and reusing and refilling plastic packaging. Yes, so this is kind of taking it up and building maybe in parts on the SUP directive, but taking it a step further still. And also in terms of recycled content targets, also the packaging waste regulation proposal contains recycled content targets that will then supersede, if you want to say, the targets in the SUP directive, but also introduce targets for all other types of plastic packaging. So it goes beyond. Yeah.
Mathilde, I think you were wanted to complement on this answer.
Yeah, I mean, not from a plea point of view, you know, from an NGO point of view. So that's you know, to ramp up the efforts on reusable packaging, and you know, I mean, basically the targets you know need to be and remain separate. So you know, there should be a separate target for reusable versus you know recycled content. So you know so this is something very, very important. And there is another piece of legislation that hasn't been mentioned by Julia, and it's the taxonomy. So the work criteria, draft criteria published on the taxonomy, so on the making a substantial contribution to this transition to the circular economy. And there is an activity which quite heavily focuses and quite heavily includes, you know, the need for reusable, like the manufacturing of reusable packaging in there. So whomever asked the question could be interested in looking at that also.
Thanks for the complementarity, Mathilde. Another question that we have from the audience is, how are the unwanted and unusable byproduct of chemical recycling accounted for in the different system of that we've been presented today? So, Gerrit?
I think that for pyrolysis, we checked with companies what is really happening, and we found out that most of the unwanted products are used for heat, for energy. And therefore, you could say we use a mass balance, and you don't need a mass energy balance, because it could also be that they use other energy input and not energy from the input. And some outputs, but maybe Carolina can tell more, some output at the end is sold for other chemical purposes or gases or other things. But in the installation, especially in pyrolysis, most of the material is going to energy. But that's also something about debate, because that's now the case. And maybe with hydrogen or other things, you could use energy from outputs, and then you need a sort of mass energy balance.
Maybe to complement that, if I may, basically, I mean, we are receiving a lot of questions on on this matter. I mean, not specifically with that wording, but with similar wording. We just want to make sure that, I mean, you know, every recycling technology, right, needs to provide safe materials for the use intended, right? Mechanical recycling, chemical recycling. So this is not a section, no? And the required safety and control mechanisms, they need to depend on the technology. What I want to say is, of course, you know, chemical recycling processes are producing some byproducts that, as had mentioned, are mostly used for pumping up or using in the same process to power up the process, right? So as an energy. Also, this is a technology or an industry where it's in the ramping up phase of development. So we need to also make sure that, I mean, this will be kind of transition, and innovation will play a key role to diminish the energy and the CO2 profile of those processes moving forward, because I mean, many technologies are now in the pipeline and will be scaled up in the years to come. So what we are through now in terms of profiles will be always be better in the future, because innovation will play in this field and in other fields that role of advancement, right? But what we want to say is all byproducts, they need to basically be handled safely and disposed securely. And of course, those processes will need to meet the process parameters defined to make sure that the materials produced are safe for the intended use. So we are as well, of course, completely aligned with that.
Thank you. And a last question, because time flies and it's almost the end of this event. A question from the outside of the Atlantic. Every discussion happening in the EU has consequences, usually worldwide. In the US, in Europe, the shift to move toward more recycling and recycling matters is based on avoiding incineration. So would you have any advice on the consequences in countries that don't have such reliance or such high incineration yield in their end-of-life treatment? So I think this is also a question perhaps more broadly on the different, like the role of the EU being a shifting, leading position in certain discussions. So perhaps also would this be that the position of the European Commission would be a bit different if the proportion between landfilling and incineration would be different in the EU? To summarize a bit the thinking.
Yes, well, maybe just to start, so we see that the proportion of land, or the amount of landfilling that is taking place within the EU varies quite a lot among the different member states, and but when we record the waste hierarchy, it is definitely the least favored option. So even coming below the incineration with energy recovery. Yes, so I think it would not change if we considered landfilling rather than comparing it to incineration, because it's even worse.
Maybe if I may, to complement what Julia has said, I just want to remark that, I mean, coming back to the point, circularity goes hand in hand with net zero, right? So the objective, not only in Europe, the objective of the world is all of industries, not talk about plastics, but whatever other, is to become net zero, because we need to fight climate change, right? We need to fight the plastic waste issue, but we need to fight climate change. So in the future, we need to think, and those are the scenarios that I just described in Systemic EQ reports, that all carbons, they need to stay in the loop, and those carbons need to come as much as possible from different renewable sources. This means in fossil use, you see, because there are CO2 emissions associated with fossil resources production, so upstream emissions associated with that. And this is something we need to avoid, and we need to basically think that circularity is a great opportunity to recircularize back new raw materials from wastes, right? And from bio wastes and from wastes or residues or any other kind of CO2 capture. That's the future, because then those are renewable carbon sources. So we believe, and we are calling for policies that are globally incentivizing all forms of circularity that I described to help us industry to navigate on that journey, right? So maybe just to complementing on that question, yes, I think those policies will be exactly the same, because we don't want to lose carbons in the biosphere landfill, which is going to be the worst source. I mean, making nothing with them and not recovering them for using back in the cycle.
I think it's a very interesting discussion because it's a worldwide market and the energy prices are also shifting. The energy prices in the US are lower than in Europe, so maybe we'll import more. You see also that the Eastman in the US, but also other companies are developing gasification, are investing in France, a very large company. And also I had a discussion with the Chinese chemical industry, and they are really looking at Europe. What will be the regulation? Will they differentiate between mechanical and chemical recycling? What will be the difference between long loop, short loop chemical recycling? And the Chinese say, if Europe is shifting this way, we have to follow and we have to change our way of producing. When you look at landfilling with LCAs, it's always very difficult because landfilling of plastics is rather good for the environment because you still CO2, but you don't want that because you need that as energy as source. So it's better to look at mechanical and short loop chemical recycling. But in countries with incineration, improve the efficiency of incineration, but also add some pyrolysis, but for a limited amount.
Thank you. And from this question, I would like to wrap up this discussion and thank everyone that has been following. Also, first of all, to the panelists for their great inputs, the real interesting presentation, and also from people listening in Europe and also elsewhere in the world, as we've seen in the US. So thank you, everyone, for your presentation, for your participation. The study that we've been referring in this event will be published in a few minutes on our website, so you can find it in our library. And again, I would like to thank everyone for the participation, the great discussion, and I really look keeping on with this discussion, and it's just the beginning of a long road and a long journey. So thank you, everyone. And on this note, I would like to close and give also the possibility to the panelists to share final words.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I just would really like to repeat my pledge from my presentation that it's really important to scale up every part of the plastics value chain and to use what we can to reach our circular economy goals.
From my side, if I may, I would like to again thank you, Laurent, for inviting us to be here representing the industry voice and those voice. And I would like to extend my invitation to Matilde, to Julia, and to Gert to discuss offline with us, but also with industry trade representatives, mostly from CEFIC and Plastic Euro, leading the efforts on this topic to make sure that we are exchanging views on how the assumptions were made for the study, and we take it from there further. Thank you so much.
I think maybe it's also good to add that the Dutch government has said that they will introduce an obligation, recycled content obligation for all plastics, not only for bottles, 30%. That will be in 2030, bio-based and recycled. So that will be an interesting example. And also, I think it's good to say that producer responsibility, gathering all the plastic, sorting all the plastic will also be very, very important because we don't have enough plastic waste for all the recycled materials we use.
No, yeah, thank you, Dorian, for the opportunity to discuss that. I'm looking forward to also more discussions where we talk about more upstream and like higher in the pipe solutions, such as designing out single-use plastics and promoting reusable plastics as well.
Yeah, and my final say is thanks to everyone. Thanks, Lauriane, for organizing the event. And we are very much looking forward to the reactions on the study.
Thank you, everyone, and have a nice end of the day.